The morning Ingrid Poole walked into a pawn shop with her Bronze Star citation under her arm, she told herself it was just a piece of paper. She'd repeated that on the 20-minute drive from her apartment in Kalamazoo, just paper, just glass, just a frame. The way you tell yourself a vaccination shot is just a pinch. It doesn't work. She knew it didn't work even before she pulled into the parking lot of Belk's Exchange on Stadium Drive, but she said it anyway, because the alternative was sitting in her car and crying again, and she'd already done that 3 times this week. 3 times was enough. She had decided that before she got out of the car. 6 weeks. That was how long she'd been on administrative suspension without pay. 6 weeks since the night she'd walked into the medication room on the 3rd-floor surgical ward at Westlake Regional Medical Center and found something that made her stomach drop. A syringe. A discarded fentanyl vial. A dose chart with numbers that didn't add up. And a patient in room 314, a 71-year-old retired electrician named Mr. Horton, who was breathing too slowly and whose blood pressure was falling off a cliff. She'd coded him back. That part went right. She was an Army combat medic for 3 years before she was a civilian RN, and her hands knew what to do before her brain finished forming the directive. Mr. Horton stabilized. He was discharged 11 days later, flowers from his daughter on the bedside table, waving goodbye at the nurse's station on his way out the door. The part that went wrong came 48 hours after that, when she filed her incident report and named Dr. Alan Sherwood, the chief of medicine's personal protege, the one they were fast-tracking for department head, as the source of the error. By the end of that week, the incident report had been quietly amended. Her name replaced Sherwood's as the responsible party. By the end of the following week, she was called into an HR meeting she hadn't been warned about. By the end of the 3rd week, she'd received the suspension letter, signed by HR Director Norbert Crane, citing patient safety concerns pending investigation. No timeline, no specifics. Just the date the suspension began, and a reminder that she was not to contact patients, staff, or hospital administration while the matter was under review. She had not been told what investigation. She had not been told when it would end. What she had been told, by a colleague who pulled her aside in the parking garage, checking over her shoulder the whole time, was that Sherwood had friends. That Crane and Sherwood had been college roommates at Michigan State. That the chief of medicine had already drafted a termination recommendation sitting in a desk drawer somewhere, waiting for the right moment. She'd taken a screenshot of the original incident report before they changed it. She had it on a USB drive in her coat pocket right now. She didn't know what to do with it. She'd consulted a general practice attorney who'd told her she had a whistleblower case, but that it would take months and cost money she didn't have. She'd gone home and sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Then she'd looked at her bank balance, which was $214. Rent was due in 9 days. The light bill was past due. She'd been eating granola bars and canned soup. The emergency stockpile she'd built before this happened, out of the same instinct that had made her stockpile supplies before deployments. 3 years as a combat medic had wired into her a bedrock certainty. The worst was always about a week away. She'd been living inside that week for 6 weeks now. She had called her sister twice. Her sister had 2 kids and a mortgage, and had already sent her $200 in week 4, which Ingrid had spent on groceries and gas and then felt terrible about. She was not going to call again. The citation was the only thing she owned outright that was worth anything to someone else. The medal itself she'd left at home. She wasn't ready for that. She might never be ready for that. But the framed display, the commemorative piece, the matted citation under glass with the Army seal in the corner, that was what she told herself was just paper, just glass, just a frame. She was still telling herself that when she set it on the counter inside Belk's Exchange. Otto Belk was somewhere in his late 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had watched every version of desperation walk through his door and had learned over decades that compassion and commerce weren't mutually exclusive. He studied the citation without touching it, reading it the way civilians read military documents, slowly, sounding it out. For acts of gallantry in connection with military operations against an opposing armed force. Specialist Ingrid Poole demonstrated exceptional composure under fire while simultaneously treating 4 critically wounded personnel, working without medical support for a period of 2 hours and 19 minutes. He looked up. His expression was careful. "I can do 150, he said. She'd hoped for 200. She said, "That works, because $150 was the difference between paying the light bill and sitting in the dark, and she'd already been in the dark in enough different ways this month." She was reaching into her purse for her ID when the bell above the door jingled. The dog came in first. He was a Belgian Malinois, lean and alert, wearing a tan tactical vest with a PTSD surface dog patch on the side and a second patch below it that read "Working Do Not Pet." He moved the way working dogs move, purposefully, reading the room in the first 3 seconds, cataloging every exit and every stranger with the calm efficiency of someone who had been trained to do exactly that and had never stopped. He was on a leash held by a man in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from a gym. It comes from years of someone yelling at you to hold it, and then years of not needing to be yelled at anymore. The man nodded at Otto. "Dunmore, I called about the donated guitar for the veterans auction." "In the back," Otto said. "Give me 2 minutes." Rafe Dunmore moved to the near end of the counter to wait. The dog, Case, padded alongside him, and then something happened that broke Rafe's stride. Case stopped. He was 3 feet from the citation on the counter. His ears went forward. He pulled toward it, not urgently, not with alarm, but with the quiet, deliberate purpose of a dog who has detected something and wants to verify it. Rafe let him come forward because Case had never once done anything without a reason in 6 years, not once, and Rafe had learned to trust that. The Malinois put his nose to the corner of the frame. Then, with a slowness that felt intentional, he set his chin on top of the glass and looked up at Ingrid. Not at the citation, at her. She had spent 3 years working alongside military working dogs in theater, and she knew what alert behaviors looked like. She knew what search behavior looked like, and tracking and apprehension. She had never seen a dog do this. She had heard about it, the comfort response, the trauma detection. Some handlers swore by it, and some said it was projection. But she had never seen it in person, and it hit her somewhere below the sternum in a way she wasn't prepared for. Case, Ray's voice was low, off. Case didn't move. He was still looking at her. His tail swept the floor once slowly, and then he was still. Rafe looked at Ingrid. His eyes went to the citation, and he read it the way veterans read military documents, efficiently extracting the key lines in under 10 seconds. His expression stayed neutral, but something shifted behind it. "You're selling this," he said. "Not a question, exactly. Not an accusation either, just a man trying to understand what he was looking at." "I'm trying to," she said. A pause, then what branch? "Army, 68 Whiskey, 3 years, 2 tours. He nodded. "SEAL teams, 6 years EOD contractor after that." He put out his hand. "Rafe Dunmore." Ingrid Poole. The handshake was the kind that means something. Then he looked at Case again, who had not moved his chin off the glass. "He does this sometimes," Rafe said, "with people. He was trained for distress detection, cortisol markers, microbehavioral changes, whatever the physiology is, but usually he's more subtle about it. He'll drift toward someone, station near them, nothing that obvious." He almost smiled. "He must think you need it." "He's not wrong," she said, and she meant it, and she scratched behind the dog's ear with 2 fingers, and Case leaned into her hand with his whole body weight like he was trying to transfer something. She hadn't planned to tell Rafe what was happening. She'd been careful for 6 weeks about who she talked to, careful about what she said and where, because she understood that the USB drive in her coat pocket was her only protection, and she couldn't afford to have it dismissed as the grievance of a disgruntled employee. But there is something about a Belgian Malinois resting his chin on your Bronze Star citation and refusing to move. Something about being witnessed that clearly by a creature with no agenda and no stake in the outcome that dismantles the careful architecture you've built around yourself. She told him about Mr. Horton in room 314, the fentanyl vial, The amended incident report, the college roommates, the 6 weeks of suspension and the screenshot on the USB drive and the $214 and the 9 days until rent was due. She told him all of it, standing at a pawn shop counter in Kalamazoo on a gray Tuesday morning, and he listened in the way that veterans listen, without filler, without the sounds people make to signal that they're following along. He just listened, and when she was done, he let the silence hold for a moment. "Timested?" he said, the screenshot. She blinked. The file metadata, yes, it would show exactly when it was captured. He nodded slowly. "I know a JAG attorney, retired now, but she's been doing whistleblower cases for 3 years and she's won most of them. I also know a journalist at the Detroit Free Press who covers hospital accountability, specifically falsified documentation, administrative retaliation, that kind of thing. He's broken 3 major stories in the last 4 years." He paused. "This is what he covers, and what she handles." Ingrid stared at him. "I'm not telling you it'll be fast or easy," he said. "I'm telling you it's not hopeless, and you're not out of options, and you don't have to be alone in it." He reached over and slid the frame back across the counter toward her. "And I'm telling you this doesn't need to be here." She didn't pick it up immediately. Her hands weren't fully reliable right now. "I can't repay you," she said. She needed him to understand that. "I want to be clear about that going in. I have $214. I'm not asking you to repay me." He said it the way veterans say the things that count, straightforwardly, without decoration. "Someone did this for me when I couldn't hold my own weight. That's how it goes." Case lifted his chin off the frame. He set it on her hand instead. She picked up the citation with her other hand and held it against her chest, and she did not cry, but the line was closer than it had ever been. The JAG attorney's name was Hammond. She was 61 years old, 5'4", and she reviewed the screenshot within 20 minutes of receiving it. Within 48 hours, she had identified 3 separate violations of Michigan's Whistleblower Protection Act. She filed the formal complaint on a Thursday morning and notified the hospital's legal counsel the same afternoon. The board meeting happened the following Monday. Norbert Crane walked into that conference room believing he was untouchable. He walked out understanding that he had badly miscalculated the difference between institutional loyalty and institutional liability. The board members present had expressions he had not seen in that room before. The expressions of people who have just learned that a lawsuit is not only coming, but is going to be meticulously documented, a matter of public record, and extremely bad for a hospital system currently in the middle of a bond offering. The Detroit Free Press story ran on a Wednesday. It was not sensational. It was measured and specific and sourced, and it named names, and it quoted the time-stamped metadata. And it included testimony from 2 other nurses at Westlake Regional who had come forward after hearing what happened to Ingrid, nurses who had their own documentation, their own stories, their own years of deciding whether acting was worth the cost. Dr. Alan Sherwood surrendered his hospital privileges 4 days after the story ran. The Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs opened a formal investigation. Norbert Crane resigned on a Friday with no statement and no severance negotiation, because he had been advised by his own attorney that negotiating was not a position he was currently in. Ingrid's reinstatement letter arrived on a Tuesday. 9 weeks after she had stood at a pawn shop counter and told herself a piece of paper was just a piece of paper. The letter was signed by Dr. Elaine Faust, Chief Nursing Officer, who had not initiated what happened to Ingrid, but who had not stopped it either, and who was honest enough with herself to know that distinction mattered less than she'd have liked it to. Attached to the formal reinstatement was a separate handwritten note. "Dear Miss Poole, I owe you more than a letter can carry, but I want to try. You did the right thing at significant personal cost, and this institution did not protect you the way it should have. I am sorry. That is not adequate, and I know it, but it is true and I mean it without condition. I hope you'll come back. I hope, when you do, you'll find us worthy of the chance." Ingrid read it twice at her kitchen table. The citation was back on her wall, the navy matting slightly dusty at one corner, from where a Belgian Malinois had rested his chin. The back pay came through 10 days later. It cleared the light bill, the past due rent, the credit card she'd run to the limit on groceries in week 3, and left a margin beyond that. Not a large one, but a margin was something she hadn't had in 2 months, and she sat with the feeling of it for a long time. She went back to work on a Monday, second shift. The nurses on her floor were careful with her that first night in the way people are careful around someone who has come through something they didn't expect to survive intact. By the third night, the caution had softened. By the end of the week, it was just work. The particular, demanding, irreplaceable work of keeping people alive, which was the only work Ingrid had ever fully understood herself to be built for. She texted Rafe on a Friday after her shift, "Back at work, all of it, thank you." He replied 4 minutes later, "Good, case says hi." She laughed in her car in the hospital parking garage, alone, genuinely, the kind of laugh that loosens something that has been clenched for too long, and sat with it for a moment before she started the drive home. People asked her, after the story broke, why she hadn't let it go. Mr. Horton had survived. The error had been corrected in real time. She could have reported it quietly, through different channels, protected herself better, avoided all of it. Some people ask this with honest curiosity, and some people asked it the way they ask questions they've already answered for themselves. She thought about room 314 when they asked, about the monitor reading, about what would have happened if she'd walked in 10 minutes later, or if she'd been the kind of person who trusted that someone else was going to handle it. She had spent 3 years as an Army combat medic learning that there is no someone else, that the gap between a person living and a person dying is often exactly as long as the time it takes to decide whether acting is worth the risk. She had learned it in a forward operating base in Kandahar with 4 wounded men and a trauma kit and no medevac inbound, and she had never been able to unlearn it. She didn't want to. There are people who survive by making themselves small, absorbing damage quietly, staying below the machinery. She understood them. She had tried, in the long weeks of granola bars and $214 in administrative silence, to be one of them. She had tried very hard, and she had failed completely, and she had come to understand that this was not a failure she was ashamed of. The Bronze Star citation hung back on its nail in its navy blue mat, and some evenings, coming home from a long shift with the particular exhaustion of a job that asks everything of you, and then asks again, she stopped in the hallway and looked at it. Not with pride exactly. Pride was too uncomplicated a word for what she felt. With recognition. With the steady, unresolvable knowledge that the person named on that document and the person who had walked into a pawn shop with it under her arm and then walked out still carrying it were the same person. She had not needed a dog to tell her that. But she was grateful, all the same, that one had tried.